Welcome to part two of my last lecture on Hitler. I am quite shocked myself by just how much there is to describe in Hitler's dictatorship. I thought that I could do it in two lectures, but it looks like it's almost uh, four lectures, and I won't take away from the other lectures. I'll just make this last lecture five, kind of super long. I guess we don't have the tyranny of a rented lecture hall. That's one advantage of doing a lecture online, is that you guys can fast forward or just wait for the next lecture to come up. You don't need to go through the bitter end, but I'm going to go to the bitter end trying to tell you um, some of the more important salient facts about Hitler, even if it does take 8 hours or 6 hours to do that. I'm feeling I'm leaving a lot out as it is already, but um, here we go. So I left off from the last lecture. Hitler is in January of 1933, completely locked out of power, just frustrated. Members of his party now are beginning to close in around him. The Nazi party is deeply in debt from all the elections they had done, and his own party members are questioning whether Hitler was right to not join the government back in the summer, since the next election, as we saw, Hitler's party actually got less votes than they had the previous in the summer. And so that summer election is going to be the most votes that the Nazi party ever gets in a free election. Um, so Hitler's actually, as I say, contemplating suicide at this point. He is so frustrated and demoralized. Um, Papen of the Central Catholic Party has been fired by Hindenburg in the previous month, and he too is bitter and demoralized, as he was completely unable to consolidate his power. And yet January 1933, the beginning of the year, is a mere 30 days away from Hitler coming into power. How does that exactly happen? And there is a backstory to this. The story spawns this kind of conspiracy theory and myth that Wall Street financed Hitler's rise and put him into power. And that is indeed a myth. You may see books out there alleging that. However, it's not a myth that there were Germans who had connections to Wall Street that indeed would raise Hitler to power. And I guess if we want to simplify it, Hitler will, the door to power will be opened by this individual, Kurt Freiherr von Schroeder, a merchant banker with the Steinbank in Cologne. And what Schroeder will do is a very simple thing. He's going to make a phone call that is going to change history, but he will be well rewarded for it. This is a later photograph of Schroeder. You can see he's wearing a SS colonel's uniform. And in fact, for what Schroeder does, he will be rewarded by becoming the SS's banker. He will process all the various private slush funds that that Heinrich Himmler is going to have in the SS, and is going to be eventually a high-ranking member of kind of the honorary membership of the SS. He's not exactly inside the functioning hierarchy, because there was a kind of honorary faction in the SS where they were allowed to wear these uniforms with the high rank, but this again was a kind of a ceremonial award, which Schroeder does. And in fact, Schroeder, probably by handling their finances, is more destructive in the historical process as kind of one of these background figures, rather than being one of the frontline perpetrators in that regime under Hitler. Von Schroeder will have, as I say, a lot of business connections indeed with Wall Street. He's going to be on the board of directors of ITT during the period that the United States goes to war. ITT is an international company owned by an American company. You might be familiar with it, or you might not be familiar with it. ITT is the international branch of AT&T, American Telegraph and Telephone Company, which began originally as a telegraph company and is a major telephone service provider in the United States. As this company began to connect with Mexico, and then connecting Mexico to overseas cables, and the French phone company and the German phone company and so forth, they had to form an international branch, which is IT&T, the International Telephone and Telegraph Corporation, which ran the telephone companies in various countries, including the one in Germany and including the one that's going to come under the Nazis' rule. And so SS General Kurt von Schroeder, as I say, is not only the chairman of the Steinbank, he's also on the board of directors of ITT. As well, he is from the Henry Schroeder banking family. And the Steinbank's corresponding bank in New York is the Henry Schroeder Bank. The Henry Schroeder Bank already has a sense that war is coming, and in 1940 they changed the name from Schroeder with the two little dots over the O, the umlaut, to Henry Schroeder without the umlaut to make it sound more American. Here's the Henry Schroeder Bank history. As you can see, it's now part of Citigroup. It was formed originally in 1818 to assist the British in retiring the Napoleonic War debt. And then eventually, with the First World War, this bank will move from London to Wall Street in New York, where it is to this day a merchant bank. It's now part of Solomon Smith Barney, and by extension, Schroeder Solomon Smith Barney Citigroup Global Markets Limited. So still going strong, the Schroeder Bank. Henry Schroeder Bank forms Schroeder Rockefeller and Company investment bankers in New York. The company, the legal firm that oversees this formation, is Sullivan and Cromwell Law Partners. I wish I had time to just talk about more about Sullivan and Cromwell and their role in, as well, all that corporate financing of German industry in the 1930s. Again, that will make this lecture 14 hours, so I won't get into that. But Sullivan and Cromwell, for those of you who have perhaps taken my espionage courses, are quite familiar with the significance of Sullivan and Cromwell. They will have a branch in Germany, and it's this branch that has a Papen connection as well. The two senior partners at Sullivan and Cromwell are Heinrich Albert and Gerhard Westrick, two German attorneys. Westrick will also go on to the board of directors of ITT in Germany, ITT Germany. Heinrich Albert will be personally selected by Henry Ford to be the chairman of the Ford Motor Company, Germany, from 1938 to 1945, where he will ensure that the Ford Company assets remain untouched by the Nazis. The Ford Motor Company in Germany continues to work for the German war effort. Thus, there was no necessity for the Nazi government to seize Ford as as an American company, because they were certainly cooperating with the war effort against the United States, and quite valuably so. Henry Ford, of course, again, I've already described kind of the admiration of the Nazi state for Henry Ford. And it's well known already, prior to even the United States entering the Second World War, Ford's connection with the Nazis, as well as his admiration for how the Nazis will destroy all the labor unions, something I haven't quite touched on yet. So Heinrich Albert is also a former German intelligence officer. In fact, he works under Papen in New York City. He's based there, and he's involved as well in running the various saboteurs who are blowing up munitions plants. So when Papen is expelled, so is Heinrich Albert, along with Papen. And it's Heinrich Albert who then becomes a partner in Sullivan and Cromwell in Germany, and as I say, will run Ford for Henry Ford, the same guy who was blowing up American companies in the period of the First World War. So it's quite an interesting kind of layering of connections. And of course, the person who is the one of the managing directors of Schroeder and Rockefeller is the same guy who put together the merger, or not the merger, the joint venture between Schroeder and the Rockefellers for this investment banking firm, and that's Allen Welsh Dulles. He is a partner in the New York branch of Sullivan and Cromwell, and of course, he will become the chief of U.S. intelligence during the Second World War, once the U.S. enters the war with the OSS, the Office of Strategic Services, the predecessor to the CIA. Lots of books on Allen Dulles. And of course, Allen Dulles is going to be important for the war effort because of those business connections. One of the most important figures in the war in Italy, a Nazi general who also had business connections, Karl Wolff, an SS general, is going to essentially surrender the German forces in Italy to Allen Dulles in exchange for not being hung. Allen Dulles, by the way, has his own number of books that he had published in the 1960s. Operation Sunrise, the secret surrender, is the case I'm describing. It ended the war in Italy about 6 weeks earlier than everywhere else. The so-called secret surrender. It had to be held secret because, of course, the Russians, British, and Americans agreed that there will be no separate surrenders or separate peace treaties conducted, that it has to be a complete unconditional surrender. But in Italy, there was this secret, very conditional surrender that SS General Karl Wolff will manage. Again, a detailed story that I just don't have the time to get into. Nonetheless, Allen Walsh Dulles will go on afterwards to become the director of the Central Intelligence Agency, the CIA, from 1953 to 1961, until after the Bay of Pigs, when Kennedy will finally fire Dulles. He was an Eisenhower appointee. His brother as well, John Foster Dulles, for whom Dulles International Airport is named, was the other partner, the other senior partner in Sullivan and Cromwell, and was the U.S. Secretary of State in the same Eisenhower administration. So both these guys are kind of future Cold Warriors. So there is indeed this interconnection of American companies, of Wall Street investment firms, and Sullivan and Cromwell, which managed some of the Dawes Plan investments in the 1930s that I described, in the 1920s that I had described to you in the previous lecture. And so what does Schroeder do? Well, Schroeder now calls Papen, who, as I say, Papen is in that right-wing military faction of the Catholic Party, and arranges for Papen and Hitler now to come together, put their heads together. Papen wants revenge against partly Hindenburg for having fired him, partly Schleicher, who became chancellor, who really represented no party, was a military liaison officer, but was unable to put together a government any more than Papen would. The problem facing everybody is that two parties have essentially the swing votes. Three parties, I guess. One party, of course, is the Social Democratic Party, but they've been in power. Nobody wants to bring them back. And so that leaves only Hitler's National Socialist Party or the Communist Party. And so the choice that people have essentially is more chaos, or now backing what many think are the lesser of two evils, Hitler and the Nazis. Key to this will be Alfred Hugenberg's DNVP, Nationalist Party. And so once Papen and Hitler start talking, they now go to Hugenberg and bring Hugenberg on and ask him for his votes. And so here you can see how it's going to work. In November 1932 is the last election. The Nazis have 196 votes. There's 584 votes. They need a majority to form a government. And so 196, the Nazis, 52 seats from the DNVP nationalists, and then 70 from Papin's Center Party, Catholic Party. Bang, 318 votes. Hitler can form a majority government with that kind of coalition. The problem, of course, is selling it to Hindenburg now, and a lot of figures from the business world, in particular, Haumer Schacht, the former president of the Reichsbank, who had negotiated the Dawes loans back in the 1920s. They all go to Hindenburg now and essentially persuade Hindenburg that they will back and control Hitler in any kind of government that might be led by Hitler as a chancellor. And key to this was one thing that Hindenburg absolutely would not do is he didn't want to put the army under a chancellor like Hitler. However, everyone reassured Hindenburg that General von Blumberg from the German army is willing to take the position of war minister in this coalition government. And Hindenburg trusted von Blumberg without realizing that secretly Blumberg was a Nazi supporter. And so with that, January 30th, 1933, suddenly Hitler gets everything he's been struggling for. He's now appointed chancellor, and he gets to form a new government. One phone call essentially opened the doors to this. And so the first series of meetings between Papen and Hitler took place in Schroeder's apartment. The German press got wind of this, that Hitler is meeting with Papen, and so the meetings are then moved to another person who's connected as well with the financial industry and with Schroeder's circle, and that's von Ribbentrop. And that's how Ribbentrop will eventually become the foreign minister and will join the Nazi Party very late, but the meetings are moved to Ribbentrop's apartment until Papen and Hitler work out their plan. So here you can see the first government sitting in the front row. Hitler, he's chancellor. Next to him is Hermann Goering, who is going to get a seat in the cabinet as a minister without portfolio, and as well he will be appointed the Minister of Interior for Prussia, which gives him immediately control over 2/3 of the police in Germany. Papen, you can see on the right as the vice chancellor. And the only other Nazi officially in the cabinet standing behind Hitler is Wilhelm Frick, who will become the Minister of Interior for all of Nazi Germany. And so we can see that Hitler essentially has secured these three cabinet positions for himself, for Goering, and for Frick. And these positions are focused on the judicial system. By having Nazi appointees in the Ministry of Interior, essentially Hitler has taken over the German policing system. And that is going to be important, of course, to his seizure of power. The rest, as you can see in this photograph, here's Blumberg, the tall individual, General von Blumberg, who Hitler will eventually purged just before he begins his incursions into Czechoslovakia and then Poland. The rest of these are from coalition parties. There's Hugenberg right there. These guys essentially do this in the belief that they can control Hitler. Papen tells Hugenberg, we're going to put such a tight grip on Hitler that he'll squeak like a mouse. And of course, what they're not appreciating is actually the kind of rat cunning that Hitler has. There's no way these fat doofuses with everything to lose, their publishers, their major corporate owners, they, as I say, have a lot to lose. There's no way that these guys are going to control these guys who have absolutely nothing to lose. And in fact, the Nazi Party is a young person's party. The average age of a Nazi is much younger than the average age of Germans, and as well the average age of party members. Many of them grew up in the post-World War I era, so they don't have that kind of bond that some members of German society made on the battlefield, in the way that Hitler as well has that bond. But most of them experience kind of degradation and the after effects of the First World War, the humiliation at Versailles, the hyperinflation, the violence, and now the depression. And so they've got nothing to lose. They see themselves as a revolutionary party without any kind of interest or anything at stake in the establishment. There's no way that Hugenberg and Papen are going to control this kind of base, if we want to use a Trumpian term. And so really who's in charge here is not this coalition government, but the government behind it, the members of the Nazi Party. Shortly after that formal picture was taken, Goering and Frick and Hitler walk across the street and take a picture of the real cabinet who's going to be in charge, the Nazi Party. And here you can see Frick, Hitler, Goering standing in behind. I recognize at least Julius Streicher, Goebbels, Röhm, Rosenberg, Himmler, and Rudolf Hess there in the background. This is who's going to be in charge. And now we have this process that the Nazis will call the Machtergreifung, the seizure of power, but it's not exactly a seizure of power as we see. It's also formally described this 3-month period between the end of January and the end of March 33 as the National Revolution or the Legal Revolution, and we'll see shortly why. The first thing Hitler does once he's appointed chancellor is he immediately goes to the German army, and very quickly in fact, the first day of his chancellorship, he ensures that he has support from the German army. The first thing he tells them is that he has no intentions of replacing the German army with the stormtroopers, with the SA, who by now outnumber the German army more than 4-1, as the number of SA men is surging. That's the plan that the head of the SA, Ernst Röhm, has. that the SA, the Nazi Party paramilitary, that the moment that Hitler takes power, that they will be heavily armed and will replace the old German army. But that is not going to be the case. And Hitler assures German generals that he will keep the German army in kind of its estate as this powerful, respected institute in the new Germany under the swastika, that he will keep the SA in check and under control, and that he is going to, he makes the same promise as well to German corporations, that he's going to make Germany a good place for German business. He's going to rein in the unions, and he's going to suppress the Communist Party. And as well, he promises the generals that he's going to abrogate the Versailles Treaty. He will start rebuilding the German army, he promises. So the generals love what they hear here. They're just perfect with that. And the next day, Hitler goes to Hindenburg and asks him to issue the decree for the protection of the German people. This now gives the German government, under Article 48, this decree will give the German government new powers to suppress disorder in the street. And it now, any kind of public meetings require a police permit. The police will as well be supported with auxiliaries from the SA, which will be given police powers as well. And so Hindenburg gives Hitler what he wants. Goering in Prussia will now form a special police force that at first is called the Gestapo, the Geheime Staatspolizeiamt, which means the Secret State Police Department, the GPA. Secret is kind of a poor translation of the term Geheime, which literally can mean secret, but it also means privy in the way we use that term in the Canadian parliamentary and the British parliamentary system, Privy Council. Privy in the sense that this police can investigate anybody, including members of the government, members of the Reichstag parliament. In other words, they have a privy access to anybody to investigate them as possible threats to the state. The only problem with the so they're not really secret in the sense of how we use that term, secret. So the real kind of translation should be, rather than secret state police, privy state police, but it gets translated as secret. The only problem is the acronym of Gestapo is GPA, and to Hermann Goering's ear, it sounds too much like GPU, the Stalin Secret Service at this point, what will become eventually the KGB. And so Goering demands that they tweak the title of this police force. And so it becomes the Geheime Staatspolizei, the Gestapo, a term which we're all familiar with, secret state police. They have powers to detain people in so-called protective custody, which is kind of like a special power that you might see under a anti-terrorist act. And these powers will be increased over the weeks, but that's how the Gestapo will start out. So 2/3 of policing in Germany comes under Hermann Goering, who we know as the commander in chief of the Luftwaffe, but he also had very senior roles in the Nazi state itself, both in economics and in the policing, early policing of Germany. Again, I wish I had more time to just go over, Hermann Goering with you as one of the minions who are, in this feudal system of the dictatorship in Nazi Germany. But again, we're just not going to have time. The other two-thirds of the police, Himmler, is made chief of police in Munich, and the Munich chief of police is also, by virtue of that office, the chief of all Bavarian police, and Bavaria accounts for 1/3 of one the not quite 1/3, but part of the 1/3 remaining of the police in Germany. So once Himmler takes control over the Bavarian police and Goering takes control over the Prussian police, 4/5 of the police in Germany are now overnight under control of Nazi party members and functionaries. It's interesting just looking at this photograph too, how you could almost read a Nazi's resume by their uniform. The chevron on his right sleeve that you can see signifies that Himmler was a member of the Nazi Party prior to Hitler being appointed chancellor. So that chevron means that they're what the Nazis call an ode fighter, and the Nazi Party will be kind of segregated between an elite old fighters who wear that chevron and the new members who flock into the party once Hitler becomes chancellor. They're kind of considered as more inferior members of the Nazi Party. That red ribbon over his right side pocket running through the button is the blood order. It means that this individual who has that ribbon participated in the 1923 beer hall putsch. And then you can see he wears a gold party badge signifying that he's one of the first 100,000 members of the Nazi party. The other ribbons are kind of SS police service ribbons. Himmler did not serve in the First World War. He would have been too young. He was 14 when the war broke out, and just turned 18 at the end of the war. He was a cadet in the German military school, but the war ended before he could see any war service, something that Himmler was very much conscious of and often embarrassed that, unlike many other fellow Nazis, Himmler had been too young to be a serviceman in the First World War. The Gestapo itself, we often describe Himmler as the chief of the Gestapo, but only nominally. The day-to-day operations of the Gestapo will be put under a former Berlin police officer, Heinrich Müller, who's not even a member of the Nazi Party. There was some controversy among the Nazis as well, as why would you appoint a non-Nazi as the head of the Gestapo? Not only a non-Nazi, but Heinrich Müller was very diligent when he worked for the Berlin police in suppressing the Nazi Party. And so he was asked, will you be loyal to the new government? And Heinrich Müller will reply, which again is typical of that dictatorship, is, well, I'll be as loyal to the government as I was to the past government. When they ordered me to arrest Nazis, I arrested them. If you order me to arrest communists or whoever you order me to arrest, I will follow my orders as diligently as I did in the Weimar Republic. And so Himmler and Hitler both said, you're hired, and Heinrich Müller will be the commander of the Gestapo throughout the Hitler administration. And he'll be one of the high-ranking Nazis to just disappear and never be found again. Nobody knows what happened to Heinrich Müller. And there's allegations as well that he might have been a Soviet spy, that he was recruited by Soviet intelligence back in the 1920s, kind of like the Cambridge Five were. And so it's not a scenario that I would completely dismiss, but there's no solid evidence for it either. He will disappear. The SA now are deputized as police officers, and so they accompany police officers. You can see that they have these armbands. Hilfspolizei, deputy police, which they'll wear. And so that comes as a shock as well, suddenly, to other political opponents of the Nazis, that suddenly the Nazi stormtroopers, the brown shirts, are deputized as police constables in the first month of the Hitler regime. That's kind of the beginning of the process of the seizure of power. And then, of course, you're going to get the Reichstag fire in February of 1933. This is going to give Hitler all sorts of excuses to introduce more rigid anti-terrorist laws. It's a kind of the 9/11 of the Third Reich. What begins a kind of a new national security state. Again, there are allegations that the Nazis burned down the Reichstag itself. We don't really have good evidence for that. A mentally disordered Dutch communist, Marinus van der Lubbe, is arrested, caught, literally, with matches in his hands, setting fire to curtains inside the Reichstag. And so he probably did it, even though the German state, I think in 2007, they officially pardoned Marinus van der Lubbe for burning down the Reichstag, but the conditions of the pardon were not that he's necessarily innocent, but that his trial had not given him, not a proper defense, and that his trial was politically motivated, which it was. In either case, had van der Lubbe not burned down the Reichstag, the Nazis might have on their own, or instigated some other incident that would have given them this kind of extra power that they're now going to get. Lubbe will stand trial. There will be an attempt to make Lubbe part of a communist conspiracy, and senior members of the Communist Party will be put on trial, but the judges at that time, who are still independent of the Nazi Party, vote to acquit members of the Communist Party on insufficient evidence, much to the outrage of Hitler. Goering himself is the special prosecutor in the Reichstag trial. And so it's a kind of a humiliation of Goering when his whole communist conspiracy trial prosecution of the communist leadership fails in the courtroom. Lubbe himself will be executed, put to death. And immediately after the Reichstag fire, Hitler now issues the order of the Reichspräsident, or decree, for the protection of people and state, colloquially known as the Reichstag Fire Decree. This now gives the German police and the SA auxiliaries even more police power to prevent terrorism. And so now the Hilfspolizei start arresting people en masse with the apparatus of both the German military and the German police working with them. And primarily, they begin arresting communists. That's the main focus of the arrest. And anybody else who vigorously on the left opposes the Nazi party, but they don't arrest everybody. They don't arrest the Democrats. They don't arrest the middle of the line parties, the Social Democrats, for example. They go after a part of the herd. And in this case, it's communists. And they set up the first concentration camps. Again, I think the history of the concentration camps is a good 3 lectures, but the early concentration camps are run by the SA, not the SS. They're particularly brutal. And so the prisoners are mostly arrested under the provisions of protective custody, as it's called. Press, opposition press is also banned, and communist newspapers are seized, their property is seized, their headquarters is seized, and in fact, the party is outlawed as a terrorist party, with the Nazis attributing the Reichstag fire to them, no matter what the courts are deciding. And here you can see just the arrests in Prussia between the 1st of March and the 30th of April. That's approximately 60% of arrests in the rest, in overall in Germany. So 16,000 people arrested over the span of 2 months, plus, let's say, the other 40%. So we're talking approximately 25,000 people summarily arrested without trial and thrown into concentration camps with no access to lawyers or the courts or anything under the provisions of protective custody. March 33, there will be an election now under the Nazis, and again, remember, under the Weimar Constitution, every time a new chancellor is appointed, there has to be an election for a popular vote on whether this appointee is approved by the German people. You can see that you have the most deputies, 647 deputies. The Nazis this time get 288 votes, but of course, the communists are all sitting in concentration camps. Despite that, you can see that the communists still win 81 seats while campaigning behind barbed wire of the concentration camps. The Germans still vote, as I say, enough communists in to the Reichstag to take 81 seats. However, they will be prohibited from taking their seats in the Reichstag. But this March 1933 election, of course, is not a free election the way the others were. The problem, of course, is that Hitler, in order, under Article 48, to be able to make constitutional changes or to have complete power, he needs to control 2/3 of the Reichstag. And, any presidential decree, again, under Article 48, can be overruled by 2/3 of the Reichstag. And so Hitler now proposes the Reichstag to vote and give him special powers. known as the Enabling Act, the law for the removal of the distress of the people and the Reich. It would give Hitler power for a period of 4 years, the same power that the president has, to issue decrees that, however, will not need to go through the Reichstag. It would give Hitler essentially dictatorial power. But the Reichstag has to approve that, and the Reichstag has to approve that by 2/3 majority vote, since that kind of law, the Enabling Act, would be in not exactly in breach, but would change essentially the constitution of the Weimar Republic. There's no provisions in the constitution for this kind of extraordinary powers to be given to a chancellor. That's why there's a president. The president is supposed to be doing this. And as you can see, this cannot be a decree. This has to be a law passed by the Reichstag. And so March 23rd, 1933, Hitler will go before the Reichstag to try to persuade them to pass the Enabling Act. We know that the communists are no longer there, so their votes will not count. They'll will be absentee votes. Hitler, minus the communists, needs to get 375 seats out of 566 that are remaining to have a 2/3 majority vote. So he needs 375 votes. If the DNVP backs Hitler on that vote, and they will, that, along with these three parties, the Bavarian Party, DDP, the Democrats, DVP, People's Party, will give Hitler 32 votes, but he still needs 35. So he's 3 votes short of a 2/3 majority. We know that the SPD, of course, will never vote for the Enabling Act. The SPD is bitterly resisting everything that Hitler is doing. And in that speech, in fact, that Hitler makes to the Reichstag, he's accused of repression by the SPD. And Hitler will say, he says, quote, "You talk about repression. I think there are only a few of us here who did not have to suffer repression and prison from your government. You say criticism is beneficial. You should have recognized the benefits of criticism during the time we were in the opposition. In those days, our press was forbidden. Time after time, our meetings were forbidden, and I was forbidden to speak for years on end. I do not want your votes. Germany will be free, but not through you. The star of Germany is rising. Your is about to disappear. Your death knell has sounded." And as Hitler is making this speech outside, the SA have surrounded the parliament and are all chanting, "We want the bill or death and murder. We want the bill or death and murder." In other words, if the Reichstag doesn't vote for the Enabling Act, the SA will go amok throughout Germany and unleash death and murder. And so how will Hitler get that 2/3 majority? Well, we can see that there's one party here who actually now holds the sway as to whether Germany will become a dictatorship or whether it will remain what as many observers said, was the most democratic society in the post-war period, the Weimar Republic, the most democratic constitution ever. The problem, the pressure on the Catholic Party to support Hitler and the Enabling Act will come from the future Pope Pius XII. At that moment, Pope Pius is still only a cardinal, Cardinal Pacelli. He's the Secretary of State. And Cardinal Pacelli has been, since the First World War, prior to becoming the Vatican Secretary of State, the papal nuncio, or the papal ambassador to wartime Germany. And in particular, of course, Pacelli sees, when the First World War ends, the disorder in Germany and the threat to German stability from the Communist Party. And of course, the Catholic Church overall is terrified of the communists, the atheist communists. They see communism as a major threat to the Catholic Church and to Christianity and to all the values of Western civilization as the Church represents them. Pacelli is very sympathetic to the German state, very sympathetic to the monarchy, very sympathetic to kind of dictatorial rule. The Vatican, to an extent, is a kind of dictatorial junta of the Pope and the Curia of cardinals as well. The Pope doesn't have the kind of ultimate power that we imagine. He is very much answers to his cardinals, who have a tremendous amount of power, and of course were the ones who elected him in the first place. But he is well liked inside of Germany, and he likes Germany just the same. And so Pius, of course, once Pacelli becomes Pope, he'll, for example, call the fascist General Franco as a savior of civilization. And the Catholic Church there will be very happy to see Franco in power, as opposed to the socialist republic that was elected by the people of Spain. The Church as well, under Gaspari, will sign a Concordat, the Lateran Pact, with Mussolini. Mussolini will give the Papal States, or part of the Papal States, a kind of sovereign state status that they had enjoyed until until the unification of Italy kind of crushed the Papal States under Garibaldi, and the Papal States, essentially the Vatican, just became a church in Italy. But Mussolini, to get the support of the Catholics and the church in Italy, will return sovereign state status to the Vatican, a kind of a postage stamp sized country, but the size of, I guess, the Ryerson campus downtown. And of course, other countries will start negotiating concordats with the Vatican, recognizing the Vatican as a sovereign state. The South American countries will come first. The United States won't recognize the Vatican as a sovereign state until after the Second World War. But Mussolini starts the ball rolling, and the Germans were negotiating a concordat with the Vatican prior to Hitler taking power. And it would have given, for example, power for the Vatican to approve its own cardinals. Under the old system in Germany, certainly under Bismarck, the German government had to approve any senior positions in the Catholic Church. It would ensure as well a separate school system for the Catholic system in Germany, and other things we'll see important to Catholics in Germany under Hitler. And so Pacelli, who will be described as Hitler's Pope in the book by John Cornwell, The Secret History of Pius XII. Although, again, there's a lot of controversy on how much of Hitler's Pope he actually was. Here's the other kind of counter argument by Rabbi David G. Dalen, The Myth of Hitler's Pope, and as well the silence of by Falconi of Pius XII. So, a lot of questions of just whether the Catholic Church, or in particular the Vatican, helped or impeded the murder of European Jews, whether they were just bystanders or whether even they encouraged it, as for example in Croatia. So, it's still a controversy. The archives of Pope Pius the 12th were supposed to open in 2020. And they did for about a day, and then very quickly the Vatican archives shut down access to them as a result of COVID issues. And so the last kind of questions that remained classified in the secret archives of the Vatican, and again, I think they're called secret in the same sense as we use the term privy, but they opened them, as I say, for a day, and so we still haven't got a clear assessment of whether Pope Pius XII helped, impeded, or just stood by as the Holocaust unfolded. There's another book on that question, The Pope's Jews, by Gordon Thomas. So the jury's out still. Nonetheless, Pacelli now warns the Catholic Party, don't do anything to screw up the Concordat negotiations. The church wants this signed. And so the other thing is, of course, Pius, or Pacelli at that point, hates Catholic political parties. He doesn't believe that political parties should identify themselves as Catholics. He thinks that's a threat to the church hierarchy, and he threatens to actually condemn the Catholic Party in Germany if they dare to go against Hitler and screw up the Concordat between the Vatican and Germany. And so that's where the votes will come from. 74 Catholic Party, Center Party votes will give Hitler the 2/3 majority that he needs to implement the law for the removal of the distress of the people and the Reich, the Enabling Act, which makes him now a dictator. The Catholics, by the way, will make this comment. They say, the Catholic Party, it will say, it is, quote, it is the right to let the new men, particularly the leaders of the National Socialists, to go ahead and not put unnecessary obstacles in their way. There are a lot of dubious things in the National Socialist movement, particularly so far as principles are concerned. But that has to be put up with for the time being. Today, there is no point in being fussy about legal subtleties. What matters is first to let a strong, efficient government grow, and then to support it wholeheartedly in order to suppress Bolshevism. End of quote. And so clearly, This is very reminiscent of the kind of debate we heard when the Patriot Act was introduced in the United States following 9/11, that Americans should be prepared to give up certain subtle liberties or certain subtle aspects of the Constitution in exchange for increased safety and security from terrorism. It's almost word for word the same kind of sentiment expressed, except instead of terrorists, we have Bolshevism as the press. And so from March 23rd, 1933, Hitler has dictatorial power inside of Germany. He becomes now a dictator. He no longer needs to go to the Reichstag. He can issue decrees as chancellor, which have the same power as a president, and he does not need to present them to the Reichstag for debate. Hitler has almost total control, but not quite yet. The only opposition left against Hitler is going to be coming from his own Nazi party, from the revolutionaries and the socialist wing of the National Socialist Party. But the Concordat will be signed, and Pacelli is happy with the result. Here you can see to the far right there Pope, who's going to be Pope Paul in the 1960s. Still a young man. Giovanni Montini. So 20th of July, 1933, the Reichskonkordat is signed, and the Catholic Church believes that it will have this kind of sovereign power to govern itself, but Hitler will very quickly re-educate them. One of the first things Hitler will do is he'll ban the Catholic Party at that point. And in fact, that's when that quote that I read to you about, let the new men let's not put unnecessary obstacles in their way. That's in fact when that quote is made, as Hitler is banning all the other political parties in Germany, including the Catholic Party. And neither will Hitler respect in many ways the kind of sovereign powers that the Catholic Church believes it has. The Catholic Church will try to avoid any kind of conflict with the Nazis. They will be honored in the state system, but again, they will not be allowed to exercise the kind of sovereign powers that they thought they could. And the church is not a kind of a monolithic institute either. There are clerics within the church who will be opposed to Nazis, as much as there will be many clerics who will support Hitler and his dictatorship as well. Hitler will now unleash the Gleichschaltung, or the coordination, for the rest of the year, from April to December of 1933. He'll pass a number of laws, for example, law on industry representation and economic associations, giving factory owners the authority to fire labor organizers by May 2nd. Hitler will just ban labor unions altogether. Law for the reestablishment of the professional civil service will remove, it's the first German law with anti Semitic provisions. It will remove Jews from the professional civil service. That includes as well university professors and teachers, as they're part of the civil service in Germany. Any socialist, Democrat, left wing, center wing government functionaries will be fired under this law, leaving behind only Nazis. Papen has already done a lot in the Interior Ministry when he fired, again, left wing and democratically inclined police officials. So Papen did a lot of work for Hitler before Hitler took power. July 14th, Hitler will ban the establishment of any other political party other than the Nazi Party, and he'll seize the assets and prohibit other parties from existing. The Social Democratic Party, the SPD in particular, as Germany's oldest party, will lose quite a substantial amount of assets that they had built up over the decades since the 19th century. And finally, December 1st, Hitler will declare this law for securing the unity of the party and state. He'll unify all the party organizations with the state. And so all these party organizations like the Hitler Youth, the Nazi Association of Lawyers, the Nazi Association of Physicians, and so forth, are unified with, for example, the Medical Board or the Bar Association, the SS, which were part of the SA and a Nazi organization as well, will now become fused with the national German state security apparatus. And so the party becomes the state, essentially. The problem remains is the German army. It is still troubled by the fact that there are all these brown-shirted paramilitaries throughout Germany. And Hitler is having problem with the SA. Under Rome, the nearly, as I say, there was, over 400,000 SA men. All of them want now to be given their rewards. They want to be, appointed as dog catcher or postmaster in their village and so forth. And Hitler is resisting doing this. And moreover, Rome, who is a former German army officer, wants the SA to become the German military, especially since at that point they outnumber the German military. Rome is more of a revolutionary than Hitler ever was. And so Rome begins making threats. He'll say in June 1933, quote, "If the bourgeois simpletons believe that it is enough that the apparatus of the state has obtained a new sign, the swastika, and that the national revolution has already lasted too long, so we agree with them. It is really high time that the national revolution ceases and becomes the National Socialist Revolution. Whether that pleases them or not, we will continue our struggle. If they finally grasp what it is about, with them; if they're unwilling, without them; and if it must be, against them." And this is a threat to the rest of the Nazi Party. In fact, SA men, there will be stripped by now of their authority to run the concentration camps. The concentration camps will be turned over to Himmler's SS eventually, although at this point, as I say, Himmler is still commanding the SS as part of an elite unit within the SA. A lot of SA men were extorting people with threats that they, if they're not paid off, will throw individuals into the concentration camps, and more middle class national faction members of the National Socialist Party are disturbed and begin to fear the SA, that there actually might be a revolution overthrowing Hitler, and the SA will follow through with the radical agenda that many of them had since the very beginning. I mean, Hitler still has not gained complete control of the party. And so, in response to what Rome says, Hitler, July 1933, will make this speech. He says, revolution is no permanent condition. It must not develop into a permanent condition. We must guide the liberated stream of revolution into a secure bed of evolution. The education of people is therefore the most important consideration. We must not dismiss a businessman if he's a good businessman, but not yet a national socialist, especially not if the national socialist, and we put it in this place, understands nothing about business. End of quote. And so by 1934, the SA numbers an extraordinary 2.5 million men. They are a threat. And so Hitler's closest minions, Himmler, Goebbels, and Goering, now begin plotting against the SA, particularly Himmler, who wants to break out from the SA and take the SS on an independent route away from the SA. And so they persuade Hitler that the SA are planning a revolt. And that is plausible, as there were a number of mutinies in the SA against Hitler when he was still running as a politician, and Hitler would have to go to these mutinies and kind of talk down the SA and back into his command. And so Himmler now prepares an operation codenamed Hummingbird, and also known as the Night of the Long Knives. The SA in June of 1934 are told that they can stand down for a month's vacation for everything they've done to bringing Hitler to power. As a reward, take a month off, go on a holiday. One of the things that they're going to use against Rome is his, as I say, Spartan homosexuality. Rome believes that, like Sparta, warriors should only sleep with other warriors, that a warrior who sleeps with a woman is kind of diminishing his capacity as a warrior. So he's openly gay, he's militantly gay, and as are many members of the SA, and especially in the highest ranks. It's not a secret. Many in Germany are aware of the aspect of homosexuality in the SA leadership, and there are, these anti-Nazi cartoons referencing that. This is from a French German dissident publication published in 1934 in Paris. Rome decides he's going to go on that vacation, and so he ends up going to this kind of resort with his boyfriend and a number of other kind of fellow gay members of the SA, where they hole up at this resort. And that's when Himmler will accuse Rome of planning to launch a coup d'etat. And so he gets approval from Hitler to launch Operation Hummingbird. And on the night of June 30th, the senior members of the SA will now be arrested and summarily executed. Along with, as well, Gregor Strasser, he'll be shot that night. Schleicher, that last chancellor before Hitler, will also be murdered that same night. Hitler will settle a whole bunch of old scores. He has a long memory. And once, of course, the SA, the leadership is purged, the SA essentially become a kind of toothless organization of Nazi veterans, kind of a ceremonial guard. They no longer have any real serious function in Nazi Germany. And Himmler, of course, gets to take out the SS from the SA organization. August 2nd, 1934, Hindenburg dies, and that's it. Starting August 2nd, 1934, no vestige of the Weimar system now is left, and there will be no new president. The day after Hindenburg's death, Hitler combines the office of president and chancellor into Führer and chancellor. And from that point on, public officials and the military would from now on swear loyalty directly to Hitler as Führer of the German Reich and people. August 19th, 1934, Hitler holds a plebiscite asking for the support of the German people for everything he's done, and 85% of the German people vote in support of Hitler. Hitler's new title is, as I say, Führer and Reichschancellor. It's a single title unifying both offices. But Führer has a more complex meaning than new president. It's based on something more than the authority conferred upon Hitler by his governmental office, which still had constitutional obligations. The title Führer laid claim to an authority overriding and transcending the state and the Constitution on the basis of a historical mission, the will of Hitler as a revelation of the German people's will and destiny, the will of an oath-bound folk formed by the National Socialist state. Ernst Huber, a Nazi legal theoretician, will formally describe this in the book Constitutional Law of the Greater German Reich. He writes, quote, the office of the Führer emanates from the National Socialist movement. In origin, it is not a governmental office. This fact must never be overlooked if the present political and legal position of the Führer is to be understood. Originating from the movement, The office of the Fuhrer has grown its way into the Reich as the Fuhrer has taken over in turn. First, the powers of the Reichschancellor, and then the position of head of state. He remains, however, primarily Fuhrer of the movement. As such, he has drawn into himself the Reich's two most exalted political leadership functions, thus creating a new office, Führer of the German people and German Reich. The Führer combines in his own person the entire supreme authority of the Reich. All public authority, both in the state and in the movement, stems from that of the Führer. The correct term for political authority in the People's Reich is therefore not the authority of the state, but the authority of the Führer. This is so because political authority is wielded not by an impersonal entity, the state, but by the Führer as an executor of the united will of the people. The authority of the Führer is total and all-embracing. Within it, all resources available to the body politic merge. It covers every facet of the life of the people. It embraces all members of the German community pledged to loyalty and obedience to the Führer. The Führer's authority is subject to no checks or controls. It is circumscribed by no private preserves or jealously guarded individual rights. It is free and independent, overriding and unfettered. End of quote. That is essentially the nature of the dictatorship. Hitler is above the state. He is above the Constitution. He is the expression of the people's will. Hitler will withdraw to his private residence in Bavaria at in this kind of ski lodge that he builds. Hitler doesn't like Berlin. He never did. It's alien to him, and he'll spend as little time in Berlin as he possibly can. Most of the time before the war, Hitler will work out of this place here. You can see this is Hitler's home. His ministers and minions will build their own little mountain lodges here in this kind of Nazi village, the ones that Hitler favors. You can see the approach. There's a gatehouse here. In fact, you can see there's people standing there waiting, perhaps to catch a glimpse of Hitler coming out the gate. This will be known as the Berghof, the mountain house or the mountain farm, or Berchtesgaden garden for a village that is at the bottom of this mountain, or for the region, Obersalzburg. Some people refer to this as the eagle's nest, but it's not the eagle's nest. The eagle's nest is actually a tea house that will be built up on one of the mountains as a birthday gift for Hitler. That's the eagle's nest, but this is the Berghof. And here, Hitler will spend most of his time. Once the war begins, Hitler will end up residing and ruling from a number of bunkers in the proximity of his various campaigns. The last one is going to be in East Prussia, but I think it was called the Wolf's Lair. But during peacetime, throughout the 1930s, Hitler will reside and rule from this house. His mistress, Eva Braun, will live there with him, although again, it's kept a secret from the German people that Hitler has a mistress or a girlfriend. Hitler presents himself as kind of a bachelor with no time for sex or relationships. And in fact, Hitler's staff, some of them are convinced that Hitler was asexual, that the two never had sex. They may have occasionally slept in the same bed, but the claim is, as I say, from his personal staff, from many of them, that he was asexual. Maybe. Here, Hitler will entertain friendly heads of state, like here you can see, or friendly European delegates. Here you can see Pierre Laval, head of the French Nazi party. Eventually, Laval, once Hitler occupies France, will become the premier of France, allied with the Germans, Vichy France. The hostile visitors or adversaries will be invited to Berlin, to another facility I'll show you in a minute. Here, Hitler's minions will follow along with Hitler. Many of them, as I say, because they want to stay close to Hitler, end up moving to this compound to be near Hitler. They have these communal dinners there, where Hitler, of course, makes all his speeches that will be recorded by stenographers and edited by Martin Bormann, Hitler's secretary, the Fuhrer's secretary. I'll get to Bormann in a second, as there are some historians that believe he's actually the most powerful man in Nazi Germany after Hitler. Hitler and the rest of them have to, Hitler likes staying up late into the night. His ministers, unfortunately, have to get up early in the morning to deal with administrative responsibilities. So it's hugely tiring. Hitler gets to sleep in. He likes to rise around 11 in the morning and stay up late into the night. This is Hitler's office in that building. So it's much more luxurious than it appears from the outside. And it'll be destroyed in an American bombing raid at the end of the war. It's quite a modern building with these vistas of the mountains at Salzburg. And it's here that a lot of Hitler's policy and decisions and debates with his minions are carried out and done. Here he is, his gray eminence, Martin Bormann. No decorations whatsoever except for the blood order that you can see here. Martin Bormann is known as the Brown Eminence, partly for, again, his kind of brown-colored uniform, but also brown in that he is kind of invisible. He doesn't make public speeches. He's rarely mentioned in newspapers, and so a lot of Germans don't even know about Martin Bormann, but he has tremendous power. Almost every time you see a gathering of senior leaders with Hitler, Martin Bormann is lurking somewhere in the background of that picture. Here's Hitler about 90 minutes after the July 20th, 1944 attempt to assassinate him. You can see he hasn't quite buttoned one of his tunic buttons. His hat is askew. His arm was injured. He's hanging onto his arm. And in fact, his right hand will begin to have these kind of Parkinson's disease tremors for the rest of his short life. He'll be certainly dead within a year after this picture was taken. But there he is, Again, Martin Bormann, right behind the Fuhrer. He's always dogging the Fuhrer, leaning over his telephone calls and so forth. Martin Bormann will become the conduit of Hitler's administration of Germany on the inside as Hitler turns to manage the war or mismanage the war. Martin Bormann will take over the internal administration, the civil administration of Germany itself. So many of the things that will happen inside of Nazi Germany will be the responsibility of Bormann, as opposed to Hitler, who becomes quite bored with running a state. He now wants to, like a board game, begin to occupying other territories and be a soldier, be a warrior, and essentially Hitler leaves the administration of Germany almost on the automatic pilot, turning it over to Bormann. Bormann will summarize all the letters and telegrams that are sent to Hitler. He will control Hitler's appointments. Martin Bormann will, of course, replace Rudolf Hess after Hess flies in 1941 to Britain. And Bormann, the title of Deputy Fuhrer after Hess flees to England or flies to England will be abolished, and Martin Bormann would just be known as the secretary to the Fuhrer. There will no longer be a deputy Fuhrer. Bormann as well controls Hitler's private finances. In fact, Eva Braun hates Martin Bormann because her allowance is controlled by Bormann. And so every time Eva wants to buy a new hat or new shoes, she's got to go to Bormann for a shopping allowance. And Bormann keeps a tight grip on Hitler's finances. The royalties, the property in Colorado, the bank accounts, all are administered by Bormann. Bormann hires Hitler's personal staff, his bodyguards, his secretaries. Bormann runs the Berchtesgaden compound. It's Bormann. If you need an appointment with Hitler, you got to go through Bormann. If you want to build a house or live in the Hitler compound, Bormann has to allocate you the land and a permit to build your house there. Bormann becomes the custodian of the Hitler legacy. It's Bormann who hires and supervises the stenographers that take down everything that Hitler says during those dinner meetings, and it's Bormann who then edits those stenographic records, and the records are available. They're published under a number of names, like Hitler's Secret Conversations or Hitler's Table Talk, different editions. There's no copyright on them, and so that legacy has survived. Martin Bormann's editing of those stenographic notes, as they say, are on the record. At the end of the war, it's Martin Bormann who will be Hitler's witness at his wedding to Eva Braun. He is kind of like the best man, except it's a civil wedding, and he will oversee the destruction of Hitler's body after Hitler's suicide, and then he will take a briefcase with all the banking information and flee and vanish with it. The witness accounts state that Bormann is fleeing with this briefcase, trying to cross Russian lines on a set of railway tracks next to this railway station. And as Bormann is fleeing, a Russian tank comes around the corner, wheels its gun, and fires around into Bormann's party. When the smoke clears, witnesses say that Bormann's mutilated body was seen in the crater, in the shell crater, still smoking. But they can't really find Bormann's body. And so the reports of Bormann's death are not accepted. Bormann will be put on trial at the Nuremberg trials in absentia and convicted. There'll be an arrest warrant for Bormann right into the 1970s. There will be a number of books, some by Ladislas Fargo. For those of you who go back that far, might remember he claimed that he interviewed Bormann in the jungle in Paraguay, where Bormann was using Hitler's money to finance the neo-Nazi movements around the world. There were all these sightings of Bormann until this former railway station is converted into a shopping plaza in Berlin. And as they're paving over where the railway tracks were, as they're leveling the ground, they find Martin Bormann's skull. And even then, there's a dental match. But of course, we didn't have DNA. They find the skull, I think, around 1972, 73. I remember I was in high school at that point where allegations begin to emerge that Bormann, in fact, is dead, that they found his skull. And a lot of conspiracy advocates argued that, in fact, the dental records were falsified, that this is, a stand-in for Bormann, that Bormann is still somewhere hiding in Paraguay running the Fourth Reich. But of course, a decade later, we have DNA technology. Bormann had many children, and one of his children volunteered their DNA. And in, I think it was the 1990s, early 1990s, the West German state officially declared Bormann dead by virtue of the DNA test. Bormann never got out of Berlin. He never survived until I think May 1st or April 30th would have been Bormann's last day on Earth. So presumably all the financial records got blown up with that shell, that Russian shell. So nothing was found other than just Bormann's skull. They didn't find the rest of him either. And you can see the impact of the detonation had actually taken off part of his head. That's the Führer side. Hitler's position as the Chancellor of Germany, of course, Speer, his architect, another minion who I don't have time to go through, will build very quickly, in the span of a year, this very imposing chancellery out of marble, which is kind of modeled on various palaces of the Roman Caesars. Here you can see the entranceway, these huge 20-foot tall doors, brass doors, guarded by SS guards, the Leibstandart SS, the life guards of Hitler, the first regiment and eventually the first division of the Waffen SS. To get to Hitler's office, this is where Hitler kind of invited adversaries and people he wanted to intimidate. You would have to walk through a series of these imposing marble-lined halls to get to Hitler's office here at the back. And you'd go through door after door after door until you arrive at Adolf Hitler's door, also guarded by 2 SS men. And this would be Adolf Hitler's, again, marble-lined office with his favorite paintings on the wall, and his office in which Hitler spent very little time. He'd come here for formal occasions. And so Hitler essentially is merging the German state with the Nazi party, kind of in the way the Soviet Union will. The Communist Party really are the government, while the ministries are essentially instruments that the party uses to impose its will over the administration of the state. The same thing in Nazi Germany. And Hitler will now introduce a series of rituals and rallies to keep people unified behind the Nazi party. The closer you can get to Hitler, the more power you feel in that feudal way. Young Hitler maidens, like the Girl Scouts, sprinkle rose petals in front of the motorcade of Hitler's approach. And he is brilliant in his use of cinema. He's a propagandist, Hitler, as is his minister of propaganda, Goebbels. He is essentially made for television, had there been television. In fact, Nazi Germany did have television, but it was kind of a very closed circuit television system that was in German military hospitals in France. They would broadcast out of a TV studio near the Eiffel Tower called Magic City, but certainly not television in the sense that we know it today. But had there been network television like today, Hitler would have just been very comfortable in it. Here you can see just the camera crews riding along with Hitler's limousine. One cameraman with a handheld camera taking detailed close-ups, another one shooting from a tripod. And so Hitler essentially will create this media persona. We could say that Hitler is probably the first celebrity politician, certainly the first celebrity dictator as well, using the new technology of moving pictures. I think only the Russians were as adept at using cinema for propaganda in the pre television age. Everything is very closely orchestrated for image and power. He's a rock star, no question about that. And very different from many paranoid dictators. I mean, Stalin, who we'll look at in the next lecture, would never have imagined wading into a crowd this way, the way Hitler does. And there are actually a number of assassination attempts on Hitler, and they all fail, which also gives Hitler the sense that somehow he's got God providence on his side. Everybody wants to touch Hitler. They're all thriving on the Hitler vibe. The closer you can get to Hitler, the more powerful you feel. As Hitler often said, the purpose of having these huge rallies is so that every German worm can feel that he's part of a big dragon. And here you can see some of these guys in the background. This guy in particular here, right there, is he's almost falling off the balcony, trying to lean into Hitler, or shooting photographs. You know, if they had iPhones, these guys would all be shooting selfies here at this point. They're basking in the Fuhrer's glory. It is indeed a feudal system, but you know, with tanks and gasoline and machine guns and eventually gas chambers. Hitler will implement all these social programs intended to increase the birth rate. For example, when a German girl marries, she will have to get a racial passport to ensure that she is pure German, that she has no Jewish grandparents in the background. She will be supplied with linens and houseware to start off their house. Eventually, of course, what German housewives are supplied with is confiscated from uh, conquered population and as well from fellow German Jews, and as well from those killed in the death camps. There's a doctor assigned. There's prenatal, postnatal care. There's instruction on the care of a child. Things that some people admire Hitler to this day for, kind of social programs. It's not a bad idea to provide these kinds of services for an expected mother, especially one who never had kids before. I mean, kids don't come with an owner's manual. You've got to kind of learn how to do it yourself. And here there is this support system for new families and mothers as well. The point of everything is, as I say, to increase the birth rate and to increase the number of German male children who become warriors. Everything for the nation. These are, by the way, the what you're looking at is from the Nazi magazine, Signal magazine, which was published for foreign audiences promoting Nazi Germany, and there is an English version of Signal, which you can get bound copies of, reprints, that was published in the only part of Britain occupied by the Nazis, the Channel Islands, just off the coast of France. And so Signal magazine, which is published in French and Italian, Hungarian, and so forth, is published on the Channel Islands in English. And so these bound copies of this magazine were republished in the 1970s, and they preserved the original German English in it, or the Nazi English. So you can read um, essentially Nazi propaganda in the original English that English speaking Nazi propagandists had composed it in. Here, for example, Hitler's plans to build these inexpensive houses for families. This is all from Signal magazine, dwellings for German workers and their families. Mothers as well would be given medals for having children, the Mutterkreuz, or the Mother's Cross. The more children you had, the highest was the award you were given. And very many women proudly wore the Mutterkreuz, having contributed a child for the Nazi state. Here you can see the various um, gold, silver, and bronze. I think this was 4 children. This was between 4 and 6. And this was 6 and up children, up to 8. You would then get a gold Mutterkreuz. But it wasn't just for having children. You had to have children with the same partner. It had to be within a marriage. The partner obviously had to have racial um, kind of his impeccable racial past as well. You couldn't be, say, on welfare. The description of the Mutterkreuz was for those families who are rich with children. or rich in children, as they say. So if a woman had, multiple partners or was unmarried, um, she would arbitrarily be withheld from being awarded a Mother's Cross. Family values is what Nazi Germany is going to be promoting. And of course, abortion is one of the worst crimes you could commit in the Nazi racial state. Judges now are as well going to be incorporated into what Hitler will refer to as German common law, as opposed to um, Western common law. The principle of Western law, certainly under the influence of the Roman Empire and the Justinian legal principles. In fact, if we go to law school, the Justinian laws are some of the first laws that you study as a law student. There are certain principles, for example, that you cannot be charged for the same crime a second time if you have been acquitted by a court. Nullum crimen senza legge. Nothing is a crime unless there's a law prohibiting that particular activity or action. In other words, you cannot be charged for something that was not on in the legal code or not described by a law when you committed that act, even if it had been subsequently made criminal. So nullum crimen senza legge, no crime without a law. The Nazi judicial system will turn that inside out. Nullum crimen sine poena, no crime without a punishment. In other words, let's not be fussy about legal provisions. If something in German common law is clearly thought to be a crime against a National Socialist state, it will be punished, even though it's not specified as a crime in the legal code of the nation. And of course, that's what the concentration camps were about, because parallel to the concentration camps, you had a prison system that would incarcerate those who are charged and convicted of a particular breach of the law. However, everybody else who the Nazis don't like can be put into a concentration camp under a different system, under sometimes under arbitrary arrest. Himmler, of course, now becomes in charge of the entire legal system. Goering goes on to better things, and Himmler and his minions will build a police state. Key under Himmler is Reinhard Heydrich, the architect of the Holocaust and the chief of national security for Germany. Himmler, and below him is actually Heinrich Müller of the Gestapo, as Heydrich will be one, the Gestapo will be one of many agencies under Heydrich. The SD as well, the Sicherheitsdienst, you can see the diamond on the sleeve, is the security police that will administrate the ghettos and also occupied territory during the Second World War. And they'll have arbitrary powers to arrest and shoot anybody, execute anybody without going through necessary legalities in occupied territories, not necessarily in Germany. Here you can see the Reich Security Main Office under Heydrich, all the different departments, and how complex this organization was. This is from 1941. all different agencies. Approximately 100,000 personnel, uniformed, badge-carrying, sworn personnel in the RSHA, the Reichssicherheitshauptamt. Hauptamt means head department. So it's a police state. This is the best definition of a police state ever, Nazi Germany. You have, of course, the Gestapo, the Geheimstaatspolizei, which you all know about, but as well, there's the Kripo, the Kriminalpolizei, the criminal police, kind of like the RCMP or the FBI, National Police. You have the ZIPO, the Sicherheitspolizei, the security police that are actually a combination of the Gestapo and Kriminalpolizei abroad in occupied territory. You have the ORPO, the Ordnungspolizei, the order police. And then you have the Schupo, the Schutzpolizei, who are like the village gendarmes and so forth, where the Ordnungspolizei are like municipal police departments. So it is a police state with very many different flavors of police. And of course, the concentration camp system, which begins as improvised concentration camps, but by 1934 is administered by Himmler. You're looking at Dachau, and you can see how close Dachau is to the town of Dachau, a suburb of Munich. Here you can see the main drag, all these houses just outside of the concentration camp. Of course, Germans living in the vicinity of the concentration camps knew what was going on to some extent. They might not know exactly what was going on inside the perimeter of the fence, but they knew about the existence of concentration camps, and Nazi newspapers as well lauded how the concentration camps are fighting criminality. In the 1930s, primarily, the concentration camps will hold political opponents, German communists, as well as criminals that the regular court, so-called habitual criminals, that the regular court cannot get enough evidence to convict on. And so those criminals will be declared simply as habitual criminals and confined in these camps. There's a special branch of the SS in charge of the camps. They're particularly brutal. They're taught to be brutal, trained to be brutal. Pity is weakness is one of their slogans. And they have this kind of power over the prisoners to torture and mutilate them, although they don't have the arbitrary power, not in the German camps themselves, to kill a prisoner the way we often imagine they do. But again, the complexity of the concentration camps is a little bit beyond the time I have in this lecture remaining. The camps are also a process of slave labor, and every prisoner in a camp will be assigned a colored triangle. Here you can see it on his pant leg, designating the type of prisoner he or she are. And here you can see a Nazi chart of the color scheme. Here's a kind of a modern version of it. Red was for communists. Green was for habitual criminals. Blue was for illegal immigrants, mostly Poles. Purple was for Jehovah's Witnesses, and pink was homosexuals. Black was for everybody else, asocials, habitual complainers, even people who didn't pay their parking tickets could end up actually, or speeding tickets could end up actually with a black triangle. Prostitutes, vagrants, grumblers, complainers, people who were, quote, work shy, who were unemployed, could be thrown into a concentration camp, and they would get a black triangle. Notice that there is no category for Jew in the concentration camp system, because Jews were not prosecuted this early in the or not incarcerated, I should say, as Jews in this early period of Nazi Germany. If you were a communist and a Jew, or a criminal and a Jew, you would get a yellow triangle sewn underneath the colored triangle itself that identified you as a Jew, but it was not a category in itself that would garner you imprisonment in the concentration camp. Not until, for Germans, of October of 1941, when Hitler will issue the order to start deporting German Jews out of Germany into death camps. And those are not concentration camps either. The death camps are a different generation of camps that have a different function. Their function essentially was to kill, while the concentration camp was to exploit the labor. And of course, the biggest anomaly here is the Jehovah Witness triangle. How can you be a Jewish Jehovah Witness, where Jehovah Witnesses are a sect of Christianity? And of course, that's the nature of the German racial laws. You were not what religion you practiced, but what religion your grandparents practiced. And therefore, even if you were a Jehovah Witness and your parents were Jehovah Witnesses, if your grandparents were born Jews and later converted, you still, as the grandchild, would be labeled a Jew. And so you had Catholics who, in 1941, in September of 41, Hitler issues the order where Jews have to wear a Star of David. Those Catholics who had Jewish grandparents would suddenly overnight have to come to church the next morning with a Jewish star sewn to their clothing. And yet they did not feel themselves to be Jews. It's an industry. Slaves are rented out to, again, German corporations. And once again, I want to remind everybody that many of those German corporations were partly owned by American investors who collected dividends on the profits of slave labor produced products, including weapons. Prisoners were rented to the point that, for example, Auschwitz is a joint operation of the R.G. Farben Corporation, the fourth largest corporation in the world after General Motors, United Steel, and Standard Oil. The fourth corporation in size was IG Farben Corporation, and IG Farben will, in partnership with the SS, build the new parts of Auschwitz, what's known as Auschwitz II, to exploit the labor there. So it's business, this kind of slavery. German concentration camps as well had this slogan in their gates: Arbeit macht frei, labor makes you free. It's a kind of an ironic term. It meant labor will make you free of being a Jew or being a communist or being a criminal. It will free you of all that. What it usually did was it freed you of life. This is from the Nuremberg trials. This is the German accounting of slave labor and how they calculate it. The income from the rentals of slaves. Average income from the rental of prisoner per day, 6 Reichsmarks, let's say $6. All right, deduction for nourishment per day, 60 cents. Average life expectancy, 9 months, 270 days, times $5.30 gives us 1431 Reichsmarks, minus amortization on clothing, those rags that prisoners wore, 10 cents deduction, profits from the rational utilization of the corpse, gold teeth pulled from people's mouths, their clothing, any articles of value, money, minus cost of cremation of the corpse, $2, average net profit, 200 Reichsmarks, total profit after 9 months, 1,600 Reichsmarks. This estimate does not include profits from the sale of bones and ashes, which were sold to German companies to use as agricultural fertilizer. To build his perfect racial state, that racial ecology that Nazi myth has been proclaiming and striving for, Hitler will, on July 14th, 1933, introduce the law for the prevention of genetically diseased offspring. This is forced sterilization. Courts of physicians can declare people with certain what are considered to be hereditary diseases, like Huntington's chorea, for example, various birth defects and so forth. If they're declared to be genetic, people can be sterilized under this law. This is not something that the Nazis invent. In fact, the Nazis model their law on laws in the United States. Here, for example, is a book from the Macmillan Company, 1929, Sterilization for Human Betterment, a summary of 6,000 operations in California between 1909 and 1929, and studying how they bettered the racial qualities and the health of Californians. Sterilization was as well practiced in Canada, particularly in Alberta, which used to sterilize native indigenous women without their knowledge, actually. And until recently, there were a number of lawsuits against the former, well, not the former, against the Alberta government for having carried out these sterilizations. And here you can see in the New York Times, when the Nazis were introducing their sterilization law, already 27 states in the United States had these sterilization laws. Of 15 states reporting, 6,246 operations were performed on insane persons inflicted with hereditary feeble-mindedness or mental disease. So what Hitler essentially is doing is he's catching a current that is everywhere around the world at that time, the idea of eugenics. However, in Nazi Germany, it's particularly touchy because of the war, the First World War. The Germans were under this great economic pressure, and there was this call that, we're spending 60,000 Reichsmarks a year on what Nazi physicians will begin to call life unworthy of life. And so, if we just sterilize these people, they won't produce these diseases that their children genetically inherit. It's going to become lethal when the chief of the Hitler the Fuhrer Chancellery, Philip Bohler, his job for Hitler is to review petitions. Hitler is getting thousands of petitions a day from Germans who want Hitler to exercise his Fuhrer power on their behalf. Can you fix my parking ticket, for example? And it's Bohler's job to review these petitions and pick ones that are worthy and bring them to Hitler for his exercise of a kind of Fuhrer power to the petitioner, granting the petitioner his request. And in 1939, Bohler gets a request from the parents of a severely disfigured child, born with a number of physical defects, including blindness, and the child lacks a limb, and the parents petition Hitler to give his permission to their physician to euthanize the child. And so Bohler now takes this petition to Hitler. Hitler assigns who was his personal physician at that time and the Surgeon General of Germany, Dr. Brandt, to go and look at this child and decide whether the child is indeed deformed to the extent that it's deformed, and do the parents really want this child to be euthanized. And Dr. Brandt sees this child and reports back to Hitler, indeed, this child should be given a, quote, mercy death. And at this point, Hitler now orders, let's just kill them all. And he orders Dr. Brandt and Bohler now to set up a systematic euthanasia program. And it's not euthanasia, because this is about saving money and purifying the race. It's not about giving people a mercy death. And so the first kind of systematic killing in Germany, aside from, communists beaten to death in the concentration camps and so forth, the first organized systematic killing that will be done by Hitler's of his own fellow German infants that don't represent kind of the healthy Aryan, so-called Aryan race that Hitler is foreseeing. It will become known as Operation T4 because its administrative offices are headquartered in a building on Tiergartenstrasse number 4. And so the code name becomes T4. And these are not killer monsters or psychopathic degenerates or sadists. These are doctors. These are educated, like Bohler, individuals who appear to be quite normal and smiling and, do not have fangs or do not have degenerate-looking faces. They're not monsters, which makes them even more monstrous. And so as now doctors are given the power to euthanize, that old, Hippocratic oath that doctors, I don't think they formally take the oath, but they do abide by the Hippocratic oath, quote, do no harm. In Germany, the slogan that replaces do no harm is going to be the hypodermic belongs in the hand of the physician. Doctors will be given the authority to take a life. And eventually that authority will be gradually expanded. Here he is when he goes on trial. He'll be sentenced to death at not the big Nuremberg trials, but at other war crime trials. Dr. Brandt, the former, as I say, Surgeon General of Nazi Germany. And so all these doctors now will go on this killing spree. And eventually, of course, it will be extended to adults as well. They'll be transported in these orange buses to killing centers where some of the kids will be used for medical experiments. Race makes a difference. If you're of pure German race, they are more tolerant of whether you'll be, quote, euthanized or not. Again, as I say, this is not euthanasia what the Nazis are doing. This is medical murder. If your color of hair has the right points, it makes a difference. The color of your eyes as well. There's this kooky science where the Nazis claim they can recognize Jews and other races from the shape of their noses and their skull dimensions. Again, total quack science, but if your skull didn't quite match the necessary dimensions, then you would be kind of confined in this killing center like a little criminal, experimented upon, and then brought down into the first gas chambers that were built. These ones used bottled carbon monoxide. The idea of the gas chambers was that these kids would just go to sleep in the gas chambers. They were told that this is a sauna. This is going to be good for your health. Breathe deeply. And of course, the idea was that they would go to sleep. But of course, these kids are disabled. They're not stupid. And so after the first round of kids goes to the sauna and they don't come back, the other kids realize what's going to happen. And so the next batch of kids are fighting, screaming. This is traumatizing the medical staff, including the nurses who have to participate in this euthanasia program. And so rather than using gas, they eventually develop a system of where they starve the kids slowly to death. They're just given enough nutrition to relieve the worst of the pangs of hunger, but not enough to sustain them. And so after several weeks of this kind of starvation diet, the kids are even too weak to sit up. And then they're given a dose of luminol, a barbiturate produced by the Bayer Corporation, and their heart will then stop. I should point out as well that in that Concordat deal with the Catholic Church, the Nazis and the Catholic Church make a deal that Catholic nurses and Catholic physicians do not have to perform the actual murder, or as they would say, mercy death. As long as Catholic nurses and doctors sign the paperwork allowing for the procedure to carry it out, there is no penalty if they do not physically perform the actual murder. And of course, a lot of doctors sign on to this program because this gives them a chance to work on childhood diseases. Sometimes, a sufferer of a particular disorder that begins in childhood may not succumb to it until they're adults. But here, as they kill the children, this gives a doctor an opportunity to actually study that disease in its early stages. And so a lot of PhDs and research PhDs get completed by doctors in this process. And many of these doctors will end up teaching in post-war German medical schools until the 1960s, when their past careers are publicly exposed, and a new generation of West German doctors realized that they were educated by killers, essentially, by monsters. The bodies are cremated. Everybody in Germany knows this is happening. In fact, Germans will protest about the murder of their relatives. At one point in the summer of 1941, Germans will actually boo and hiss Hitler, if you could believe that, over this issue of Hitler murdering their relatives who, he starts killing adults as well, not just infants. And as well, Germans sent these photographs complaining about the smoke. In particular, some housewives complain that as they're cremating bodies at these killing centers, that the smoke has little bits of hair and human ash in it that clings to the laundry that they hang out the sheets to dry. And can't they just do the cremation at night? So, as I say, Germans are very much aware of this, and in fact, again, there's controversy among historians, but after Germans begin hissing and booing Hitler over this medical killing, Hitler winds down the actual T4 project in the summer of 1941. What historians, however, debate about is whether Hitler had actually achieved his number. He wanted to kill approximately 100,000 Germans in this process. Statistically, they killed 72,000 by the time that T4 began to wind down. Other historians argue that these killings were actually then moved to other departments, that indeed T4 was wound down, but the medical murder continued in various forms afterwards, but more secret than before. They will as well, in occupied countries, just shoot patients in psychiatric facilities or disabled patients. And on top of that, Germans as well start systematically in Poland, starting from 1939, killing the Polish middle and educated classes with the intention of destroying the Polish race. So apart from approximately 2 million Polish Jews that will be murdered by the Nazis one by one, approximately 2 million non-Jewish Polish citizens will as well be murdered in these kinds of shootings and hangings, which will continue throughout Russia as well, in Yugoslavia. Essentially, the system of genocide will grow out of that early medical killing. So, in kind of order of killing, Hitler starts with his own German babies, moves on to the Poles, and then afterwards, starting from approximately September, October of 1941, he will begin systematically murdering the European Jews. And after the Jews, he would have come for everybody else who's not a German. These are pictures again from Poland, where Germans shot something like half of the Polish clergy because they saw the clergy as possibly being a source of resistance in Poland. They shot all the Boy Scouts because they feared that the Boy Scouts will become resistance fighters. Hangings were public, meant to show people what any kind of resistance to German authority might mean. Children were often brought to the hangings so that they grow up knowing how to respect Nazi authority in their occupied zone. Hangings often took place in public places where a lot of people would pass. And as I say, they amounted in millions and millions of um, murders. There's no other word from this than murder. And of course, eventually, as well, the systematic murder of the European Jews. Starting with the Einsatzkommandos, which begin actually in the spring of 1941, and their orders are very basic. Suppress communist opposition. It's left up to them to interpret that communist opposition means kill all the Jews as well. So there is no systematic plan to kill the Jews. The Einsatzgruppen are interpreting for themselves what it is that is wanted of them. And that, again, is the kind of functionalist theory of the Holocaust, that Hitler never gave a direct order, kill the Jews. He just kind of let out these hints that the world would be a better place without Jews in it, and allowed his minions to find the most radical solution that they can that will please Hitler. As Ian Kershaw said, working toward the Fuhrer. And it's only in around September, October of 1941 that they decide, the bureaucracy essentially proposes a systematic final solution of the Jewish problem, as the Nazis referred to it. And by then, they're, of course, killing all the women and children as well. A lot of these killers are actually suffering from what we call perpetration-induced post-traumatic stress disorder, that killing women and children puts a normal person into a trauma, having committing this act. And indeed, the divorce rates, suicide rates, alcoholism, and drug addiction, particularly to amphetamines, which are being distributed to the killers. Methamphetamine is not a recent drug. It's one that's developed by German pharmaceutical companies to keep soldiers awake on guard duty and high in combat. And so amphetamines and alcohol are the primary drugs used by the killers as they kill one-on-one, one by one, people after people after people, families, children. They come home at the end of the day. Their wife kind of washes the blood out of their tunic. Many of them are traveling with their wives and children, particularly the officers, and they play with their kids, and then the next day they go back and they kill 20, 30 more women and children, one by one. Again, everyone is assigned their own victim. It's not like there's firing squads, and so, as I say, suicide rate, divorce rates, combat fatigue, although they're not in combat, but combat stress, combat fatigue, post-traumatic stress disorder, as we now know it, becomes a huge problem among this 100,000 or so killers. And so what the Nazis will come up with, and at this point, it's hard to discern Hitler's own dictatorship, how much Hitler is micromanaging all this. We know he's micromanaging the war, and that is probably taking up all his time. The rest of this is just becoming almost like Germany on autopilot. Germans are, again, in that kind of feudal system, cutting out their own fights. And as well, the way it's arranged, there's a kind of an assembly line process where Germans do some small part of the genocidal process. They schedule a train. Another German will drive the train. They'll guard the train, but they won't actually kill anyone. They'll sequester property. They'll transport Jews into a ghetto, but none of them are actually killing anybody. They're just one small turn of the screw in the assembly line process. So, there's a kind of uh, uh, um, a communal distribution of guilt, with the only person who has to take the brunt of this process is the one who pulls the trigger at the end. And of course, the trigger pullers are the weakest link in this assembly line process of murder. They're the ones who are having mental breakdowns. And so this is where the Nazis now will come up with a new solution. By the way, for those of you who are interested kind of in what was happening with those trigger pullers and how their kind of mental state and how it is that these quote ordinary men become killers. Christopher R. Browning's Reserve Police Battalion 101 and the Final Solution in Poland. This is a middle-aged group of police officers in a reserve battalion that is deployed behind German lines. Essentially, their job is to direct traffic behind German lines and, kind of control order and behind the German lines. They're not even partisan fighters. They're essentially traffic cops who are assigned behind the German lines in occupied Poland on a temporary basis. They're not an elite Nazi unit. They're not members of the SS or the SD. Many of them are not even members of the Nazi Party. And at one point, they're suddenly given the order to kill Jewish women and children. And what happens and how they get divided up and what various ordinary men in this battalion do is described by Christopher Browning, based on trial transcripts of some of these police reservists after the war. And it's a fascinating insight, not just into the Nazi process, but in any kind of war crimes and genocide that is perpetrated to this day. Essentially, Browning concludes that they did it for the team, that many hated doing it and actually suffered trauma from doing it, but did it because they didn't want their fellow police officer in kind of that brotherhood to take the brunt of this disgusting thing that they were doing. And in fact, Himmler would make speeches to these killing units telling them that if they liked what they do, he would be ashamed of them. That what makes it such a glorious thing for German history that they hate what they're doing, but despite of their hate and disgust for what they have to do, they're doing it for the better future life of German children growing up who will not be threatened by this Jewish threat that these guys are killing. He says it's a glorious page in German history that will never be celebrated because what we're doing is we're doing this in secret. How much of this is Hitler, as I say, is hard to say at this point. I do a 42-hour lecture on the history of Nazi Germany at Ryerson, and once Hitler takes power, aside from his, as I say, mismanagement of the war, Hitler almost becomes a postage stamp, a image, a poster, a word, the Fuhrer. He is not exactly exerting any kind of active management of what's happening inside of Germany. It's just on the battlefield. And so the solution, whether it's Hitler's idea or whether it's the minions, is now to industrialize the killing process. Gas chambers are built not to increase the capacity of the killing. because in fact it's harder to kill in the gas chambers than it is just to shoot people. What the gas chambers are is a way to relieve the post-traumatic stress that the killers are suffering. The idea of the gas chamber is the same as it was in the euthanasia program, that people who are going to be exterminated, who just go into a gas chamber and fall asleep without any kind of trauma for their killers. Their killers don't even have to see it happen. They just pour these cyanide crystals into the gas chamber vents, and the people are supposed to die quietly inside the gas chamber. And now, on arrival, the Nazis put doctors on the ramp to select who lives, who dies. We often think that the doctors are there. As you can see, this doctor has just selected a woman holding an infant in her arms. She's being directed to a gas chamber on the right. She's being directed to that gas chamber because she's carrying an infant. And had she not had that infant in her arm, she would have been directed in the other direction, towards the left, where she would have become a slave laborer and would do her best to survive 9 months of Nazi slave labor. But because she has this infant, who's going to take the infant into the gas chamber? Right? She has to carry it. And so the doctor has just condemned her to death. It's a medical procedure. The killing is medicalized. Remember, the syringe belongs in the hand of the physician. And so the sergeant, the captain, the lieutenant, who is now, guarding the convoy of people who are directed to the gas chamber, really aren't complicit in the death. It's the doctor. They're just following doctor's orders. It's the doctor who has decided they won't live, because you don't need a medical degree to see that an infant can't work, or the old lady that you could see just to the left of the doctor is incapable of working. You don't need a doctor for that. You or I could do that job. Any sergeant or corporal or even private could do that job, sort out who is fit to work and not fit to work, just by looking at them. It's the killing authority that is essential here. And so that's how the Holocaust in the end is medicalized through the gas chambers. And in fact, the people who are actually pouring the gas into the gas chamber, now they're the trigger pullers. They're all medical personnel. They're so-called disinfection officers from the Waffen-SS. They're medical personnel, and they're supervised by the doctors. This is how Nazi Germany perfected genocide and managed to eliminate, as they say, that perpetration-induced post-traumatic stress disorder. And that's the point of the doctors on the ramp. Hundreds of doctors sign on for this duty, and they're lured to it in various ways. Here you can see an SS doctor with the medical stem on his sleeve. These doctors are lured to this death camp duty by promises of grants that they can study some of the people in the camps on their various programs. And this is how Dr. Mengele gets involved. Here he is, the notorious angel of death. Dr. Mengele is particularly interested in experimenting on twins, and so he's assigned to Auschwitz on the sorting ramp, as it's called. But in his free time, he can experiment on twins and other experimentation. Mengele's particular experimentation is he's trying to change the color of their eyes. He's injecting dyes into their eyes. He's also carving up one twin, especially with twins, and comparing various physiologies with the other twin. Obviously, Mengele is interested in twins because he hopes to clone perfect Germans if he can uncover the mystery of twins. Best book on this, Robert J. Lifton, The Nazi Doctors, Medical Killing, and the Psychology of Genocide. He looks at all three things: the so-called euthanasia, medical murder, concentration camp duty on the ramp, and medical experimentation. I think it's the master study of Nazi doctors. Well advised, still in print. The prisoners, again, it's a business operation. Auschwitz, as they say again, is run by I.G. Farben in partnership with the SS. People's teeth gold teeth are pulled. Dental bridges collected. Their personal belongings, especially gold wedding rings. All these are melted down into German gold bars. And then the gold bars are smuggled into Switzerland, or actually, they don't even have to be smuggled. They're just deposited into Switzerland, into the Bank of International Settlements, that same bank that as well is collecting the dividend payments for Americans on shares in German corporations during the war, including any shares they may have in IG Farben and so forth. So these Holocaust assets taken from murdered Jews and other peoples, these were never recovered or identified. They're circulating in your pockets as nickels and dimes, as interest on corporate investments in at the Bank of International Settlements. We know in the 90s, Jews that had opened accounts in Swiss banks to shelter their property and their assets from seizure by the Nazis. Those assets were identified, and New York State forced Swiss banks to release those assets to the descendants of Jews. Prior to that, of Jews murdered in the concentration camps. Prior to that, the Swiss banks were demanding from the surviving family members a death certificate in order to access their murdered relatives' property. And so it's in the 1990s that New York State threatened to not renew Swiss banking licenses in New York unless they did something about this, that these Holocaust assets were finally identified, but not the ones that were taken from Jews murdered inside the camps, from the property they carried, from their gold teeth, their cash, their eyeglasses, their watches, their jewelry. All that was melted down into these gold bars, which again were deposited into the Bank of International Settlements. And as I say, dividends were paid out to those investors, not only American investors, but other foreign investors in German corporations, although primarily there were Americans investing under the Dawes Plan. It was indeed an industrial process. So by the end of Hitler's regime, they had to literally bulldoze the bodies away. 17 million people. Certainly not as many as Joseph Stalin, certainly not as many as Mao Zedong, but there's something about how these murders were perpetrated that stands kind of head and shoulders above what Stalin will do. And as I say, we'll look at that in the next lecture, or Mao Zedong, who I might not dig into as deeply as I've certainly plan to do with Stalin next. I don't have time to describe Hitler's conduct of war. It's such a, this would be another 6 lectures just to look at how Hitler mismanaged the war. His early victories were achieved on hunches and gambles, where against the advice of senior German officers, more experienced officers, and Hitler had luck with him. In fact, that's what Heil Hitler means. When you greet someone Heil Hitler in Nazi Germany, this wasn't hailing Hitler. This was a greeting that meant, may you have the luck of Hitler, Heil Hitler. Like Gesundheit. And so he did have that luck, but it begins to fade, of course, after 1941. And by 1944, as the Allies are landing as Normandy, as the Germans are now retreating from Russia, as the Allies are moving up Italy, German General Staff now begins to see Hitler as a problem that should be removed, at least certain members of the German General Staff. Count von Stauffenberg is the adjutant between the German army and Hitler. He offers to kill Hitler, and the plan is to kill Hitler with a bomb inside this bunker you see at the back. It's going to fail because at the last minute it's hot, and they decide to meet in a wooden hut, which is going to dissipate the detonation. Stauffenberg, at this point in time, German officers can carry their sidearms around Hitler. Any one of them could have just shot Hitler like a dog, but they don't have the guts to do that. And so they're going to have this elaborate bomb that Stauffenberg will carry into the meeting and put at Hitler's feet, and then claim he has a long distance call he has to receive from Berlin and leave the room with a timer going. And somebody kicks the briefcase out of the way and puts it kind of behind a bulkhead under the table, kind of supporting the table, that blocks the blast from reaching Hitler. This is what that table and that room looks like after the detonation. And so the only thing they succeed at doing is killing a whole bunch of other German officers and wounding many and shredding Hitler's pants. That's the best they do. And so 2 hours later, Hitler comes out shaken, but appearing to be okay. And this, again, Hitler sees as providence. And Hitler, of course, will now blame the German army for all his failures. There'll be trials and these hangings on piano wire. You're looking at Hitler's hangman, Friesler, a judge, who just berates these German officers who go before him in trial. Friesler won't survive the war. He'll be trapped in a courthouse during a bombing, and a big burning beam will crash down on him, killing him. These German officers And as well as anybody else Hitler wants to purge that late state July 1944 will be hung by piano wire as a punishment in this kind of hanging chamber that is now a memorial to the German resistance. How much, we should lionize the German resistance against the Hitler of these officers. You know, they wanted to kill Hitler in order that they can prosecute the war much more efficiently than Hitler. So, in fact, had they killed Hitler, they could have possibly, knowing what they're doing, inflict many more casualties on us than Hitler's mismanagement did in the remaining time of the war. So, I question whether we should, lionize this military resistance to Hitler in the way we do. It's not quite the case of noble motives for trying to kill Hitler. As the war continues, the only thing Hitler is interested in is kind of the architectural rebuilding of Berlin that he still plans to carry out with Speer. In the end, Germans will be faced with just old men and children defending Berlin. You're looking at one of the last photographs taken of Hitler before his death, as he's issuing iron crosses to German children who were now fighting the advancing Russian army into Berlin. Hitler ends up here as left-wing radicals rage in the streets above. Hitler's in the White House bunker. Oh, sorry, wrong guy. As the Russian army is raging in the streets above in Berlin, Hitler ends up in this underground bunker. And once Berlin is surrounded, Hitler will decide to commit suicide. He'll first kill his dog, Blondie, poison her. Then he'll marry Eva Braun. And several hours after they're married, they will retire to Hitler's private chambers in the bunker. And on this couch you're looking at, they will kill themselves. Eva Braun will bite down on a poison cap. So Hitler will either hold a pistol to his head and as he bites down on the cyanide, pull the trigger, or afterwards, a member of his staff, perhaps his valet, will enter the room and give Hitler a coup de grace with a pistol to the head. And again, there's controversy among historians whether Hitler actually shot himself or it was kind of a post-mortem shot put to him by one of his guards. In any regards, Hitler's staff survived into the 90s, and none of them will admit that they might have actually shot Hitler. And so, as far as we know, Hitler committed suicide. You can actually see the blood here on the couch where his body would have been found. Recently, a scrap from that couch was sold by an auction house with Hitler's blood on it. It's about a square inch. It was sold, I think, $14,000 was the successful bid. Bloodstained fabric from Adolf Hitler's suicide couch, 2014. Damn, I missed the auction. His body and Ava Braun's body will be carried out of the bunker and then put in the crater, and they'll attempt to cremate it, but it's a failure. The Russians will find the remains of Hitler. That's Hitler's body there, a photograph that the Russians will release in 1967. Up until 67, it was unclear what happened to Hitler, and thus you had all these theories that Hitler escaped to, Brazil, or that he was in Argentina or Paraguay, that he was, escaped by submarine or by airplane. In fact, there's this ridiculous TV series on the History Channel. Please, enjoy the History Channel, but don't imagine that history is what you're looking at when you're watching the History Channel. It's the fantasy history channel. It's not history. It's junk, garbage. Hitler's body and Ava Braun's body here will be taken away by the Russians, and then Stalin will not reveal that he actually had the corpses for reasons that we don't quite know why he kept this kind of thing secret. The Russians will keep the bodies in Germany until about somewhere early 1980s, just before Gorbachev comes to power. And a decision is made at that point then to destroy the bodies. And so the bodies are exhumed and destroyed. But Hitler's head already was taken to Moscow and was kept separate from the body, as are his teeth, his dental bridges. And it's in 1991 that the Russians, for the first time, allowed foreign journalists to see Hitler's body. And I had an opportunity as well, as I was working in Moscow in 91, to actually hold Hitler's head. They brought it out to me in this paper bag, in fact, although these are not my pictures. For me to be able to take pictures of Hitler's head, there you can see the entry wound is actually part of his skull, the skull cap, the cranium. It would have cost $100,000 for the right to photograph and videotape the body parts. So someone actually did. They came up with the money. I didn't have that kind of budget at that time. But here you can see the charring, the bullet wound. There is this kind of story that for a while Stalin kept this part of the skull on his desk and used it as an ashtray. And indeed, if you look on the inside of the skull, there are these kind of burn marks that looks like somebody was stubbing out cigarettes or a cigar in it. Recently, there have been allegations that this is actually not Hitler's head, that that this is a female skull. However, I think those allegations were disproved. It's a recent thing. So as far as we know, this is Hitler. I can reassure you that considering Hitler's health by the end of the war, he probably would not have survived much longer than 1945 or 46, or maybe at best 47. He was in terrible health. Parkinson's disease. He had stomach disorders. He was addicted, as I say, to amphetamines. He was, hitting the meth pipe, essentially. That, I think, is part of the paranoia that Hitler began to display in the kind of the last years of his regime. So, Hitler's kind of glorious dictatorship ends, after 12 years in, like a rat in a bunker. The bunker is still there, but it's covered up completely. This is approximately the place in Berlin where the end of Hitler's regime came. These are the last images of the bunker when it was opened in the 1970s prior to being sealed. It's flooded with water, had to be pumped out. Very little was left in it. And Hitler came to the end of his life approximately in this part of Berlin, the mall of Berlin, essentially. A kind of very, very, squalid ending for a dictator. So that's, I think, as much as I have time to tell you about Hitler. There's so much I left out, but again, I want to get to other dictators, and so I'm leaving this as part of lecture 5, and we still have 3 more lectures to go, and I'll see, if I can do Stalin now in one lecture. Now that will be a miracle, and I hope I'll be able to deliver to you that miracle later, as the next lecture will go online.